I have a lot of weird encounters outside my office on my smoke breaks, but I think this one takes the cake, even with how anticlimactic it was. Today, I was sitting on the wall outside of my building smoking and messing around on my phone. I had probably been sitting there for about 2 minutes without even looking up, and when I finally do, I notice a guy on the corner about 20 feet away just staring intently at me. He's hunched over, facing me in the classic zombie pose, wearing a large coat, a surgical mask, and gloves. I don't know how long he'd been standing there either, but it was a daytime and the area is relatively populated, so despite being the only people on the street, I wasn't too worried about it. I went back to look at my phone, but kept discreetly glancing in his direction just to see if he was still there. He didn't move or stop looking at me for probably another minute and a half, just sunken shoulders with his unblinking eyes pointed directly at me over his mask. Finally, I noticed an older man walking towards us, and my cigarette is almost finished, so I assume worst comes to worst. This guy will be near if anything happens. I glance back at my phone and I hear what I assume are the older man's footsteps approaching. Before I have a chance to look up, the surgical zombie guy is sitting within an inch of me on the wall. Now, I'm a polite girl, so I give him a vague smile while my inner self and personal space are screaming at me to get up and leave. He asks me for a cigarette, so I give him one and he just continues to sit there with it unlit in his hand. I can't fight my manners, so I ask him politely if he needs a light, and he gives me a gloved double thumbs up and stares right at me. I ask him if that meant he had one, to which he responds with another double thumbs up. I assume that was him saying he did, so I turn back to my phone, planning on taking one more drag before getting up to leave. He then says, "Yes, I need one." So I give him my lighter. He hands it back and I put my smoke out and stand up. He then begins laughing, like full belly laughing. I didn't really know how to respond, so I tell him to have a nice day and walk to my building. To be honest, I've never really had a fear of people, and I can't say this is the first time I've had someone that has done something like this, but the mask and gloves really added to the absurdity of the entire situation. It's Friday night at around 8:45 p.m. The little one's in bed, and I'm chilling with some friends online, just gaming casually. There's a loud bang, and I'm instantly freaking out. Due to having my phone, my safe place, invaded by some creeper twice in the past 3 months, I turned the volume on my computer down, trying my best to come up with excuses. Oh, it was the neighbors doing something. Who in their right minds would try to break into my house when they could still see that I'm awake? Front outdoor light on, lounge light on. It's quiet for a while, so I return to playing the game and talking to my friends. And that's when I hear rustling. I think it's coming from the game, despite the volume being super low, but to be on the safe side, I turn the sound on the computer off completely. The rustling is still there. Okay, so at this point, I think it might just be an annoying possum. The banging could have been it jumping onto the garage roof, and now it was snuffling right outside the leaves, searching for food. As I said earlier, who would try to trespass when they could clearly see somebody was home? If they did trespass, why would they be doing it so loudly? I want to say it put me at ease, but it really didn't. Fast forward half an hour and the noises have stopped entirely, and my cat's begging me to be let outside. The little bastard. I hate opening doors, curtains, windows at night. It's just paranoia at its finest. But tonight, I had a reason to be paranoid at least. I kept the chain lock on the door and let the fat fuzzball squeeze out, and had a bit of a peek through the crack to see if anything was amiss on my front lawn. Nothing out of the ordinary that I saw, so I lock the door and head back to the lounge. 5 minutes later though, someone tries the door handle. Finding it locked, I hear a laugh, and they start scratching on the glass as I frantically grab my phone and call the police. Whoever it was had left by the time they answered the phone, and police couldn't find evidence that anyone had been on the property. They did a whole clean sweep of the neighborhood, but couldn't find anyone on the streets either. Whoever you are, I'd say let's not meet again. but I'm pretty sure you're the same person who came the other 2 times, and I'm fairly certain that that person is my ex. So, Mr. X, if it is you, smile for the cameras next time you come around. They just arrived in my mailbox. It was a very long time ago, back in 1973. I remember it was summer, and I was 6, and we were living on Monica Lane in Madison, Wisconsin. The thing is, I sort of recalled it, but never really put 2 and 2 together until a few months ago, when I was talking to my mother, who went into great detail. I was a very gregarious child, outgoing, extroverted, friends with everyone. It was at that time a middle-class neighborhood, and 3 houses down from ours, on the same side of the street, was a huge park. Now, my mom was a nurse and my dad was a salesman, but my mom worked a second shift at the Meritor while my dad worked days. I rarely, if ever, had a babysitter, only if they went out for dinner or a movie. But they did go out often, and there are always older kids in the neighborhood to babysit. One sitter who I really enjoyed lived only a few blocks or so away, and down the street just a little bit. Vicky had babysat a few times before that, and it was pretty uneventful. She'd play games with me and do my hair, play dress up, pretty basic stuff. So anyhow, one day I had gone with friends down to the park. I remember there was a ball field at the time and a sand lot next to the field. My friends wanted to play on the monkey bars, but I wanted to play in the sand. I looked at the sandbox and my babysitter, Vicky, was standing there. I told my friends I was going down to the sandbox and I ran off. We played in the sand, building a castle, and then she asked me if I wanted to go get something cold to drink. It was stifling hot because, of course, it was summer, and so I said yes. She takes me by the hand and we start going to walk to her place. She starts telling me about her puppies and asking if I want to play with them. Of course, I get giddy and now can't wait to get to her house. And this is where my memory had kind of just stopped. And after my mother told me what happened, the rest flooded back, unfortunately. My mother just happened to be talking to my sister and I about some of the places we lived, and we got to Monica Lane. I told her I remember the park and how big it seemed, and she asked if I remember being kidnapped. I immediately thought she was kidding, and then the look on her face told me otherwise. She said it was around 5 in the afternoon, and one of my friends had come to the door to ask me to come back outside. Sure, that I had gotten bored and walked back home. When my mom checked the house, she realized I wasn't there. And keep in mind, she's 7 months pregnant with my sister, so she's sprinting to the park screaming my name. After asking several kids if they'd seen me with no clue, she went to the ball field and asked the older boys if they'd seen me at all. One of the boys, I think she guessed around 14, said that he'd seen a younger woman playing with the girl that fit my description in the sand and walk off in a general direction, and that was all he knew. My mom ran across the street to one of the houses and asked to use their phone and call the police. By the time the police got there, my dad had come home and some of the neighbors were trying to help my mother. So there's this search party out looking for me, screaming my name and knocking on doors. The police had gone back to the park to ask the boys if they knew who had been with me and if they knew who she was. Between the boys in the neighborhood, they had deduced who it was that had led me off, but I have no idea how, honestly. The police and the entourage go to her home. She lived with her parents, but they weren't home, and knock on the door. She came to the door and told them she hadn't seen me and that she'd been home all day. The police asked to come in for some reason, so she said okay. They went through the house and went to the basement, and then there they found me. That's what my mom knew, and then I remembered. It was literally like a floodgate opening, and I just started crying. At 6, you sort of trust everyone, and she'd been in our home. I never got a bad feeling from her, and my parents didn't either. But when we walked into her house, I remember that cold, holy shit feeling washing over me and getting very worried. I remember starting to cry and saying I wanted to go home over and over. She takes me into her kitchen and gets me a glass of water and a tissue. I hear dogs barking, and next to the kitchen is an open stairway that goes down to where the barking was coming from. She starts trying to cajole me into going downstairs, telling me there's all sorts of toys and games. I reluctantly agree, and she grabs my hand to head down the stairs. The dogs are going nuttier, and I start screaming. At this point, Vicky starts to get extremely bizarre. She's screaming at me, "Shut the fuck up! If you don't shut up, I will throw you in the cage with the dogs and they will eat you. Shut up!" Dragging me down the stairs and still screaming. I was scared out of my mind. I remember crying so hard I was hyperventilating, and I am screaming so hard I'm not making sounds. Vicky then flips a switch and starts being syrup sweet, trying to calm me down. She tells me that she was just playing a game and tells me that she wants to play hide and seek. She must have been relatively skilled at calming me down, because the next thing I know, I hear knocking on the door upstairs, and I wasn't crying. The houses were all the same sort of tract houses that Sears used to sell. Not huge, but not small. But you could hear everything at any spot in the house. I kept hearing the knocking, and she tells me that it's her friends. They're coming to play hide and seek. She convinced me to let her put a piece of masking tape over my mouth so I wouldn't make a sound, and lifted me into this big wooden box next to the kennel. She put a big pile of blankets over me and told me to be really quiet so they don't find me. The whole time the dogs were going batshit, but when she calmed me down, they calmed down too. They still looked incredibly mean, but they were no longer frothing at the mouth and only slightly growling, until the knocking began. I remember scrunching in there, confused, still scared and convinced that the dogs were going to get out and eat me. I was crying again and hyperventilating. I remember taking the tape off my mouth because I couldn't breathe, but I remembered I needed to be quiet because I was afraid what she'd do if I screamed. I laid in that smelly box next to that big bag of dog food, sweating to hell, tears rolling down my face. I sort of pushed the blankets to the side, but only enough so I could pull them back over me when someone came. I recall thinking about my dad and wondering if he'd come find me. All of a sudden, I hear what sounds like adults yelling my name. They come down the stairs and the dogs are going crazy. Over and over, men are yelling my name, and then I hear a man say, "If you don't shut those effing dogs up, I will." I was in a large storage box. Think like a carpenter's toolbox kind of thing, with tape hanging off my mouth when they opened the lid. I remember a very nice man asking me my name and if I was okay. I don't remember answering him in anything other than screams and tears and grabbing his neck so hard my dad practically had to pry him off me. I remember my parents taking me to the hospital to be checked out, and that's all I really remember. Mom said that Vicky was found guilty of attempted kidnapping, and last she knew was in prison, but couldn't remember when the last time she had heard anything about it. We moved from the area shortly thereafter, and I haven't been back since. I do know that my mom said that her parents were odd, but that they didn't know them. She had met Vicky from neighbors that had used her as a babysitter and had never heard anything bad, and that I always seemed happy with her. She lived in the general neighborhood, but it would have been 2 blocks over and 1 block down. My mother said that they never picked her up. She always walked over, and when they'd get home, they'd drive her home, but never noticed anything out of the ordinary at all. Mom and Dad had only met her parents when they came to the door to ask for forgiveness, that Vicky hadn't meant to do anything bad and was a good girl. Mom said my dad picked up her dad by the shirt and told him that if they ever came on our property again, he'd kill them. I remember her name and sort of what she looked like, but would have no idea if she walked up to me who she is. The other day at work, we were basically told to look out for ourselves and others, wait for a security guard, etc. Now this was a normal thing for the suburb we live in, but it was still a bit strange. My friend from night, Phil, told me why. Their friend and coworker finished up at around 12 that morning and was approached by this guy when he was at his car. The guy looked pretty normal, tackies and all, and gave him an envelope claiming there were free Fringe tickets inside. Side note for clarification, Fringe is an art festival, like music and comedy and dancing, etc. There was some sort of white powder on the ticket, but he just assumed it was cocaine or something, which again is not uncommon in this area, so he just grabbed it, planning to throw it out later because it was probably counterfeit anyway. Not wanting to spark any conflict, it's unpredictable around here, especially at midnight. His mates came out around 12:15 to see him with something like burns on his hands. That's happened to be where he touched the powder. and he said it felt like he was burning on the inside and couldn't breathe properly. Luckily, he was still conscious and told them to take him to the hospital, which luckily wasn't that far away. They got there, and practically everyone that came into contact with him felt like they were burning under their skin and were having all sorts of breathing difficulties within minutes. They had to call hazmat fires and everyone who decontaminated. Luckily, everyone was okay. Around 9 p.m., I heard the telltale rumble that meant the forecasted storm was about to start. I couldn't recall if I had rolled up my car window when I got home, so I went out to check. It was already dark out, and I live in a part of town that isn't big on streetlights at night, so sometimes it's hard to even stay on the sidewalk without crashing into bushes. The dumpsters are about 200 to 300 feet from my car on a U-shaped street, tucked into a corner that backs into trees and a small creek. I live on the back of the building, so once I round that corner, you can't see me from my car, nor the dumpsters. I got out of my car, and as I rounded that corner, I could see what looked like a flashlight in the dumpster. Weird, but not alarming, as there are a lot of teenagers and young boys who just mess around in that corner of the parking lot. My window was down a bit as I was rolling it up, and I hear a clattering sound from the dumpster. I turn to see someone climbing out of the dumpster and start shining the light on the other dumpster. My daughter had left her window down too, so I walked around to her door and rolled her window up. I slammed her door shut a bit harder than I meant to, and since I was then facing the dumpsters, I could see the dumpster man freeze and swing his light in my direction. He immediately switched it off right as I started to walk back inside. He started to full-on sprint toward my direction. My usually sedentary butt has never moved so fast as I noped back onto the sidewalk and to the back of the building. I quietly opened and shut my door, locked in hopes that with 8 apartments back there, he wouldn't know where I was. Or maybe he was running for reasons entirely unrelated to me. Or maybe he was just messing with me and is now having the laugh with his friends about the lady he just scared the crap out of. Whatever it was, I'm sure as shit not getting any sleep tonight. This past weekend, my soon-to-be wife Alexia and I had just settled down for a night of movies, pizza, and cuddling. We live in a residential area right outside of town. Our home is situated right across the street from a church with a large cemetery behind it. Most of our neighbors don't own pets, but there's one in particular across the street and downwards a bit who owns perhaps the loudest, most annoying dog to ever exist. Quite an annoyance on a night like tonight, but luckily it was quiet for the entire evening. It's around 10 p.m. and we're lying down watching a film in our living room when the loudest dog on earth begins to go off. Unfortunately, there's nothing much we can do except maybe confront our neighbor or file a noise complaint, but who wants to be the neighbor that does that? After about 5 minutes, I get up off the couch and decide to walk over to our neighbor's home and say something about the dog. As I headed outside and made it to their driveway, unfortunately, I noticed that the neighbor wasn't home, their only car not there. I decided anyway to walk up to the door and ring the bell. After a minute of no one answering, I gave up and headed back towards home. I noticed that Alexia had stepped outside and was looking on towards the direction of the barking. I told her that no one was home and that we should either ignore it or finally file a complaint. No one should have to deal with a loud dog at night, especially if you're trying to unwind after a long day of work or you're just trying to get some sleep. My wife, or soon-to-be wife, and I headed back inside for a bit, and finally, after about 10 minutes, the dog ceases to bark. Alexia and I exhaled and laughed a bit before continuing our film. But of course, not long after that, the dog starts up again, and this time, it sounded vicious. I got up, went outside, and approached our neighbor's fenced-off backyard and saw the dog for myself, who must have heard or saw me coming. It stopped barking, walked up to me, and began to pant in the cute way that dogs do. I chuckled and said the dog's name, to which he looked at me and sat down. Such a good animal, even if he is so loud. I then heard something that sounded like somebody walking through leaves, coming from behind me and to the right. I turn around to see somebody looking at me from behind a gravestone in the cemetery. The dog must have heard this as well, as it sprung up and began to bark in the direction of the gravestone. I looked on as the person continued staring in my direction and as the dog continued to bark. I looked towards my house where I saw Alexia standing near her car, looking at me with a confused look on her face. I looked in horror as I saw the person reveal himself from behind the gravestone. His forehead and cheek were stained red with blood dripping down off of his chin. In his hand must have been some sort of dagger. The dog began to go ballistic as the person took a few steps in our direction before stopping. I turned to the dog, then back at my home. Alexia, who was still outside, yelled out to me what was wrong. I told her to call the police. She said, "Why, the dog?" To which I replied, "He's fucking armed!" Probably confused, Alexia went inside to grab her phone, and as I continued to watch on as the person now began to back off hesitantly, the dog began going berserk. It was going to take a bit of time for someone to reach our home, so I readied myself to go into the self-defense position as I watched the man finally turn around and walk away towards the back of the cemetery, towards the woods. When the police finally arrived, the person was long gone and I was stuck there explaining to a couple of skeptical officers about my encounter. They didn't seem to take me that seriously, but still investigated the area as I explained to Alexia about the person I saw. When the police left after finding no trace of virtually anybody, Alexia and I didn't feel much better. We locked our doors and windows, and I decided to call our neighbors to fill them in on everything before heading back to continue our movie night in the most spectacular fashion, The Exorcist.
Do you remember when the world ended?
Amanda is my brother's girlfriend, and at the time of this story, she was looking for her first ever apartment and moving out from her parents' house. Her and my brother didn't want to move in together since they had only dated for a few months. She opted instead to search for a roommate online. Browsing Craigslist, she found an ad titled something like "Roommate Wanted, Females Only." Now this sort of thing was common since the area she was looking in was mostly young professionals. The listing was for a room in a house for about $225 a month, which was quite cheap. The occupant listed herself as a 23-year-old college student that wasn't comfortable with living with any males. The other roommate would have their own room and attached bathroom. So far, Amanda was into this deal. However, the listing only had a single photo from the outside of the property. Amanda sent an email wanting to meet the occupant and tour the house. Within 30 minutes, she receives an email back with all the details and time to stop by. The girl worked late hours and wanted Amanda to stop by 8 p.m. When Amanda arrives, there is a handwritten note on the front door saying, "Door broken. Use the back door." Walking around the house, it looks nice but slightly unkempt. Tall grass, weeds, dusty windows, etc. Still no alarms for Amanda though. When she knocks on the back door and an older man opens the door, at first Amanda thinks she has the wrong house, but the man reassures her and says that the occupant, I forget the name, was out and he was the landlord. The occupant asked him to meet Amanda since she was working late. He seemed pleasant and offered to show her around. Alarms start going off, but aren't at red alert yet. First, the guy was clearly in his 40s, unshaven, and looked like he lived in his car. Also, only the kitchen light was on. As they walked around the house, Amanda noticed one huge red flag. No furniture. Like at all, nothing. The landlord was polite about answering questions, but seemed irritable to keeping on lights for too long, rushing her around and only letting her look at rooms for a few moments at a time. There was a single room that the landlord wouldn't open, telling her that it was the occupant's room and he didn't want to invade her privacy. As they walked down the hallway into the living room, she notices the front door has a plank nailed across it. Broken, for sure. Amanda's creepometer is starting to ding, so she decides to wrap up the walkthrough and leave, but trying to be polite. As she's giving the guy her "thanks for the showing" bit, He perks up and states that how he forgot to show her the basement. It's been recently furnished and would be a great rec room, and she should take a look down there. At the time, Amanda and the landlord are standing in a small hallway between the front living room and the back kitchen, and this little hallway was the basement door. When he opens the door, it opens outward to create something of a barrier between Amanda and the back door. The basement is pitch black. He smiles, motions down the stairs, and says, "Ladies first." What happens next is nothing more than a stroke of luck. Amanda get a text just as some random person parks in front of the house. Thinking on her feet, she pretends it's a phone call and answers her phone. "Hey, yeah, are you here? Okay, I'll come out from the back and let you in." "Oh, it's great, you have to see it." With a motion of confidence, she excuses herself around the landlord and walks her out to the back door. She says the guy just looked at her like he was confused. Once outside, she sprinted to her car and sped like hell out of there. When Amanda got home, she told her mother and my brother everything. Cops were called, they took her statement, etc., and they went to investigate. The Craigslist post had been removed. The house had been foreclosed over 6 months earlier and the property had been abandoned. When the police investigated, they found that the closed room the landlord didn't want her to look in was where the man had been staying. There was a pile of old dirty blankets, rotten food, and empty gallon jugs everywhere. More creepy was he had plastered ripped up pages from porno magazines on all the walls in the room. The really scary part of this was the basement. The man had tied a thin piece of fishing twine at about shin level across the stairs, about halfway down. The basement was empty except another pile of old blankets, a broom handle wrapped in leather belts, and a small box with a few assorted tapes, like duct tape, electrical tape. Amanda ended up not moving in since we clearly knew what the man's intentions were now. I was 17 at the time, and I had just gotten my first job. I lived in rural Western Virginia in a small mountain community. My mom's friend owned a camping resort not far from my house that had a general store, and she said she'd pay me to help out in the store during the busy months in the summertime. It was a pretty easy job, and I met a lot of out-of-towners, which was nice because our community could get so isolated. I mean, most of us lived pretty far away from each other. One day, a big, burly mountain man type came into the store. He was in his late 40s, early 50s, probably 6'5"-ish, and about 280 pounds. He looked dirty, like he worked outside a lot. His clothes were sort of tattered and he had a long beard. He bought some basic items, one of which was one of his homemade soap bars. And when he came to the register, he looked me up and down very carefully. He didn't talk for a minute and just stared. His people skills clearly needed work. "Did you make this soap?" he asked gruffly. "Possibly," I said. "I help out with that sometimes." "You make a lot of stuff on your own?" "Toiletries and things like that, yeah." "I like that," he said, nodding to himself. I honestly did not know how to respond, and I quickly rang up his items, and he paid with crumpled up, greasy money. Right before he left, he asked, "You cook too?" "Sometimes," I replied. "Bet the boys round here are itching to marry you," he said as he smiled to himself. I said nothing. I was puzzled as to what I said that stood out as wife material. I told Krista, which is my mom's friend / boss, about the bizarre encounter, and she just laughed it off. So did my family and friends. But then, Mountain Man started turning up more often and more often. We chatted a little bit here and there, and I found out he had a cabin in the woods. He claimed he built with his bare hands. He said he hunted and lived off the land, other than the things he bought at the store. Over time, our chatter escalated with him making comments about how nice it would be to have a woman like me around who could make those things and cook his kills. One time he even said I had the birth and hips that men lust after. He even started inviting me to fish with him, hunt with him, see his place, etc., and I always politely declined. But he got more and more insistent, and I told Krista about how uncomfortable he was starting to make me. The intensity with which he said those things really scared me. She said that when he came in, go get her and she would ring him up. Thanks to her, I started speaking to him less, and I thought I wouldn't have to deal with him anymore at all. But one night, I was closing up, and it was late, I want to say around 10 at night. Krista at this point had left about an hour before, and I was leaving by myself. The only 2 cars in front of the store were an old blue pickup and mine. I was immediately alarmed because I knew Mountain Man drove a blue pickup, but I didn't see him in the lot, just his car. So I walked quickly to my car and checked the back seat before I started her up. But then, when I first turned the key into the ignition, I got nothing but sputters. I tried several more times and got scared quickly. Of all nights, why is this happening tonight? I remember asking myself just angrily, just as I was reaching for my phone to call for help. There was a loud pounding on the driver's side window. I am utterly shocked that I didn't piss myself on the spot. I didn't even want to look because I knew it was him. But I did, and my suspicions were confirmed. He smiled a big, greasy grin at me, showing me exactly which teeth were missing. "Need some help?" he said loudly through the window. I shook my head furiously. "My dad is on his way," I said, hoping to scare him off. I hadn't spoke to my dad in years. Mountain Man just laughed. "No, he's not," he said. "Open the door." The hairs on my neck stood up straight. How did he know I was bluffing? "No," I said firmly. "Leave me alone." Suddenly, he looked angry. He pulled the handle, but I had locked all the doors when I first got in. He kept furiously pulling the handle and started pounding on the window. "Leave now or I'm calling the cops!" I screamed at him. He clearly wasn't getting the message, so I pulled out my phone and called 911. I must have sounded hysterical to the dispatcher, and I knew she could hear him pounding. She said she would have officers out ASAP, but out here? That could be a while. "The cops are on their way! Leave now!" I screamed at Mountain Man, who didn't seem to let it deter him. But after a few more minutes of pounding, he suddenly stopped, walked back to his truck. I watched him go. Hopefully he would just leave me alone. But then he started walking back toward me with a fucking crowbar in his hand. "No!" I screamed at him. "Get the fuck away from me!" He started swinging at the driver's side window with a crowbar like a maniac. I ducked down into the passenger seat on the floor and covered the back of my neck like they teach you in those tornado drills. I heard the sickening crack of the window, but not for long. Suddenly, I heard male voices shouting, telling Mountain Man to get away from the vehicle. I sat up and saw 2 men approaching, one with a shotgun pointed right at Mountain Man. I recognized them as a couple of guests staying at the resort for a camping trip. I breathed a sigh of relief and got out of the car, telling them that the police were on the way. I thanked them profusely as we waited for the police, and surprisingly, Mountain Man didn't make any moves to get away. But the cops came pretty quickly after that, so he didn't have much of a chance anyway. They took him away, and then I gave my statement. I was pretty shaken up for a while afterwards. A few weeks later, I finally got the scoop on the man. Apparently, he had a long history of mental illness and had been in and out of state institutions. He really had been living in an old cabin in the woods where he wasn't taking his meds. They found a journal that Mountain Man kept. Apparently, in it he said he was lonely and wanted a wife. He mentioned me by name a lot, and Luke said that there were a lot of lewd things in there about me that he really didn't want to share, but I'm sure you can guess. But he also tried to put it simply by saying that Mountain Man had a detailed plan to abduct me, starting with sabotaging my car engine to get me into a vulnerable position. And when Luke said that, I nearly burst into tears, thinking about how horribly that night could have gone if those 2 men hadn't come along. Thankfully, he has been put back into the state institution. With any luck, he'll stay out there for good. Mountain Man, let's never meet again. I live in North Wales, UK. For anyone who has had the pleasure of visiting, it is truly a beautiful place to live, though for an adolescent boy, it is certainly lacking in things to do. As a result, my friends and I would often find ourselves mindlessly exploring areas of countryside and coastline. Despite it being quite sparsely populated, in comparison to the closest cities, there is a dual carriageway running right along the coast from Wales into England. Also, train tracks run alongside this road for most of its course, occasionally passing overhead via a small cement bridge. Anyway, there was one night a few years ago when about 4 of us randomly decided to try and explore the inside of one of these bridges, as one of the group had observed a manhole cover nearby, which we believed to be the entrance. On closer inspection, we discovered that several tools would be required to gain entry. We returned with the necessary equipment and proceeded to unbolt the cover. It wasn't long before we had removed the heavy steel disc and had started descending the ladder down into the structure. Once we had all safely reached the bottom, we decided to progress to the other side. At this point, we were totally confined into the narrow space that leads into the main area. So, as we squeeze and crouch and at one point scrape along our bellies to the other side of the structure, there is a growing sense of claustrophobia between us. The distance from one end to the other is surprisingly long, but by the halfway point, you can look down through the narrow gaps on the motorway below. This was actually pretty cool, which helped keep us calm in a strange way. At this point, apart from the mild discomfort and confinement, we were still just a group of guys on an adventure. But that was about to change dramatically. No more than a few meters beyond halfway, which we could tell due to the symmetry of the passageways through the bridge, one of us claimed they could see some object in the distance at the far end. Slightly hesitantly, we agreed to investigate. Bad move. I reached the end first, and let me tell you, I have never felt the same sense of dread before or since. In front of me was a single fold-away chair positioned facing a wall. On the wall was a partially torn page from a newspaper or a magazine showing a fully naked lady in an erotic position. The reason I didn't just refer to it as porn because something was different about it. I can't put my finger on it, but it seemed more sinister than sexy, if that makes any sense. More disturbingly, the eyes of the woman on display had been cut from the page, removed with precision and not just hastily ripped off. The scene that lay before us had rendered us completely speechless, and an overpowering sense of panic could be felt collectively. That was when we found the condom. The horrendous, gut-wrenching, blood-drenched condom. Needless to say, we got the hell out of there as fast as possible, smashing our knees and shins against the sharp cement edges that lined the path to the ladder by which we had entered. Of course, we were all praying to God that the manhole hadn't been resealed, as it was impossible to tell until you reached the ladder itself. Thankfully, the exit route was clear, and we promptly dashed as far as our legs could carry us. I'm sure this ending comes as a disappointment to some of you, as we luckily never bumped into the twisted individual who sits in that chair, but I must stress how radically out of the norm this was given where I live. I sometimes think, no, not recently, as I'm more or less forgotten about that night entirely. About the person who climbs down to that bridge and navigates through the darkness to sit facing a wall and do God knows what. You honestly couldn't envision a more surreal, horrifying situation. A week or so before my 10th birthday, I walked to the corner store with a $5 bill and picked up a jar of ragu for my mom. On my way home, a man I'd never seen before fell in step with me and began talking. "Hi," he said cheerfully. "My name is Dr. Ramsey. I'm a pediatrician. Do you know what a pediatrician is?" I walked along silently, not really replying, and fervently hoping he would take that as a sign he should just leave me alone. Subtleties were not his strong suit, though, because he kept right on chattering. "Are your parents looking for a pediatrician for you? Of course, you're almost a big girl now. You'll be needing another kind of doctor soon, won't you? That's okay, though. They can still bring you to me until then. What's your name? You have beautiful hair. I was just on my way to get some suckers for the candy jar in my office. Do you like suckers?" Thankfully, we were nearing my house, so I ran forward, up the back steps and into the kitchen door. I didn't know it then, but that was the beginning of a very long, very scary ordeal. It didn't take long after that for Dr. Ramsey to begin showing up. At first, it seemed benign enough, at least to a kid. He would drive by nearly every day, smiling and waving. I told my mom, who said maybe it was on his way home from work, but then the phone calls began. My dad called me into the living room and sat me down. He asked about the day Dr. Ramsey followed me home, and if I talked to him. He said I wasn't in trouble, but that I needed to tell him the truth. I told him no, and he asked if I was sure. Could I be forgetting something? I told him no again, and he frowned. Then he asked, "Then how does he know your name?" I didn't know. It turns out that was not all he knew. He knew my sister's name as well, and pretty soon neither my sister or I were allowed to answer the phone. He called several times a day. At first, neither of us knew what he was saying. And then one night, one of my brothers told us that he was telling my parents that he was going to hurt me, and later on, my sister. Things got complicated after that. My dad had called the police, but as this was before there were any stalking laws, there was not a lot they could do. They told my parents to call back if he tried anything. My dad then called a friend of his from back in the day who happened to be a cop. For the next month, my dad's friend escorted me to and from school. Suddenly, life as I knew it came screeching to a halt. I couldn't walk to school alone. I couldn't play outside. I couldn't walk to Super America, which is sort of like a 7-Eleven for those who aren't familiar with that. Then, one afternoon, my sister, two of my brothers, and my mother and I were in the kitchen. One of my brothers saw a glimpse of someone in the garage. They'd seen him too. Dr. Ramsey came bolting out of the garage, my brothers chasing after him. They ran all the way to Cherokee Park, where he lost them in the trees. My parents called the police again, but nothing came of it. The only information they had was a description and a name that was almost certainly fake. A couple of weeks later, we woke to find our dog hanging from the side porch. She was a gorgeous saddleback German Shepherd, born the same day I was. We were all devastated. The cops said there was no evidence it was him and ruled it accidental, but none of us believed it. We all knew. His phone calls became more and more informative in the meantime. He would talk about who was home and who wasn't. If my brother would say my dad was home, he would tell him who was really in the house. He would also talk about the house itself, about the window in the kitchen he could easily open with a knife, and from the outside even when it was locked, and about the French doors that connected the living room to the side porch, and how the lock could be finangled from the outside if you jiggled it just right. That night, my dad put in some carpenter nails at the bottom of the French doors until he can get a new lock ordered. My parents had to go to a company event for my dad's work, and my older brothers were at Saints West roller skating rink. My sister was on the phone with her best friend. My little brother was on the floor asleep. I was watching Devo on the midnight special with Wolfman Jack. It was late. Suddenly, the top of the French doors swung inward, and in the few milliseconds before the nails in the bottom caused them to snap back, I could see his silhouette. My sister whipped the phone at the television, and we ran up the stairs. About halfway up, we realized our little brother was still asleep on the living room floor. As quietly as we could, we slipped back down the stairs to get him. We all went to our bedroom and didn't turn on the light, and this way we could see outside. We watched out the window for a while, and when we didn't find him, we crept down the hall to our brother's room to look. We looked down and could see someone standing at the back door. He knocked, loudly. "What do you want?" my sister asked out the window. He stepped back and said, Is this the Mercy residence? I have a pizza for delivery. Can you come to the door? She scoffed at him, declaring she was not stupid. She could see he didn't have a pizza, and she was calling the cops. He then left. A short while later, my brothers returned home. We told them what had happened, and they walked around the yard watching for him. They came back in, and things settled down. By now, we'd pretty much given up on calling the cops because it never helped, so we just went back in, each of us, except my younger brother, who was still asleep, carrying a knife from the kitchen just in case. Eventually, one of my brothers went into the kitchen to get a bowl of cereal as a snack. You know, that sensation you get when you could just feel that someone's watching you? Yeah, he had that in spades. He kept looking around the kitchen, through the doorway into the dining room, at the windows, but he didn't see anything. But he could still feel the eyes on him, so he went closer to the door to try to see better. The kitchen lights were reflecting on the windows of the door. It had 3 rows of 3 windows. So he still couldn't see. He stepped closer, and then closer again, until he was right up against the door. And then he cupped his hands on either side of his head so he could see. There, on the other side of the window pane, was Dr. Ramsey, smiling back at him. He turned to yell for my older brothers, and when he looked back again, he was gone. They went out again to look for him, but didn't see him around. A couple of weeks later, I was at school and we were outside on the playground during recess. I was swinging upside down when I saw that now familiar blue Ford Galaxy cruising by, moving slowly. And there he was, smiling and waving. He called my name, and I ran to the teacher and told her. The school had been told all about him, and she took me inside right away and called my mother. That same day, my mom had gotten a call from the school office asking her to verify that my dad was picking me up, as he'd called to say he was on his way. He wasn't. Not long after that, I woke up one night, thirsty. I went down to the kitchen for a drink, and there, sitting alone in the dark, was my dad. On the table, a gun. He was tired of the police waiting until Dr. Ramsey tried something. He was tired of his children being terrorized. He was tired of being afraid every time he left for work that something would happen to us while he was gone. I sat with him for a time, watching before he sent me back to bed. These events and many more took place over a period of around 18 months. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. He had vanished from our lives entirely. The phone calls, the drive-by with the creepy waves, everything. For a long time, during and after the Dr. Ramsey days, I would have reoccurring nightmares in which I would wake up to find him standing over me as I slept. It took a long time before I felt like a kid again. I don't know what happened to him when he disappeared. I don't know if he was in a car wreck, locked in prison, in a coma, but sometimes I wonder if the wait ended for my dad when he was sitting in the darkened kitchen one night. I don't know, and he never did tell me, but I really do think he did end it at one point, although I'm sure I don't really want to know what happened.